Pandemic is a game where each player is going to be part of a member of the CDC, working together to try to stop an outbreak of 4 different diseases. They're going to outbreak in different parts of the world. The players will have to work together. They're either going to win together or lose together over the course of the game. Now, I've kind of done some basic setup. We put the infection rate marker up here at 2. We've set outbreaks at 0. I've shuffled the player deck, put it here, shuffled the infection deck, put it here. Now I've set aside our epidemic cards, and a couple cards just as an example to show you what the player cards look like. In order to start, we're going to deal each player a roll card. There are 5 rolls in the game. You're only going to play with 4 of them, so there'll always be one roll that's out. So in this case, we figure out who we have. So we have the dispatcher, so we put the pink player. All players are going to start here in Atlanta. The researcher, the medic, and the scientist. So all of our roles are right there. In this case, we will not be playing with the operations experts. They won't be in the game. Each player also gets 2 player cards to start. That's their starting hand of cards. Now each player card comes in one of 2 types. They're either going to be a city card, so it'll be like this, in which case it'll be yellow or black, red, or blue, and it'll have the city name matching that color. So you can see this says Lima. It shows me on the board where it's at. Or it'll be a special action card. Special action cards have the name of, up here at the top, has the text of what will happen when you play this card. The thing to remember about these cards is they can be played at any time. You can play them on somebody else's turn, and they do not take an action to play. But they will take a space in your hand, and you can only have 7 cards in your hand. If you ever have to draw a card that would take you over 7, at the end of your turn, before we get to the infection rate, you have to discard back down to 7 cards. So now the next thing we're going to do during setup is we're going to place these epidemic cards in the player deck. Now, they have the same back as the player cards, right? So what's going to happen, though, when you draw one of these is it's going to increase the rate of infection. So basically, the game is going to get faster and faster as the diseases spread. Each epidemic card will walk you through the steps that have to be done. So the first thing it'll do is increase the infection rate. So that's this right here on the board. We'll move that up. As you can see, since we're starting in the very basic, this is an introductory game, we're going to start at the farthest here at 2, but eventually it'll get to 3 and then to 4. We're then going to infect a city. We're going to take a card off the bottom of this deck. So in this case, it says Delhi, India. We would take 3 black cubes and put them in Delhi. We would then discard that card and then put it in the discard pile. All the cities that are in the discard pile would be shuffled and placed on top of the deck. And then we would draw and infect cities again at the player's turn. So each of these we're going to put into one of 4 piles. This is going to create our draw deck. Now, as you get better at the game, you can increase your difficulty by playing with more epidemic cards. So we're starting again, basic game. So we're going to play with just the the infection rate at the farthest at 2, and we're only going to play with 4 epidemic cards. This is about as simple as the game gets. If you want it even easier, you could play with just 3 epidemic cards, but you want a little bit of challenge, I recommend 4. As you can get better, you can play 5, and then when you think you've really mastered it, you can play with 6. So you basically can tailor the game for the difficulty level and the experience of the players. All right, we're going to give each player a reference card. And now the final thing we're going to do for setup is we're going to infect some cities. We're going to start by infecting 3 cities with 3 cubes, 2 cities with 2 cubes, 3 cities with 2 cubes, and 3 cities with 1 cube. At the end, you should have 9 cities infected to start the game. So let's start by turning it over. We're going to put cubes matching the color of the city in that city. So for instance, we're going to put 3 black cubes in Riyadh, 3 blue cubes in San Francisco, 3 blue cubes in Toronto. So those are our initial hotspots for this game. We'll now do 3 cities with just 2 cubes. So we'll put 2 cubes in Mexico City, 2 cubes in Hong Kong, and 2 black cubes in Mumbai. So now we're going to do 3 cities with just 1 cube. So we put 1 cube in St. Petersburg, 1 cube in London, and 1 cube in Sao Paulo. Now, every time you play this game, it's going to be a little different because you're infecting different cities initially, and you're going to have different cities come up as you play. In our game right now, blue has the most cubes on the board, and it'll be the disease that has the most trouble for us. We have a little bit of some trouble over here in the Middle East, but I think South America and the Far East are both safe for us. So we need to focus our efforts up here in blue. Your game is going to be different when you play. You might have more cubes in the Middle East or in South America. You're going to have to go wherever the diseases are breaking out. So now on your turn, each player will take 4 actions. And there are 4 basic actions you can do and 4 special actions. So first, a player on their turn. So for instance, I'll be the dispatcher. On my turn, I can move from one city to another for 1 action. This is called driving or ferrying. If you're going to cross land from, say, I'm going from Madrid to Algiers, crossing this would be just driving. Crossing from Washington to New York is called ferrying. But either way, both of those take 1 action. It does not require any cards. You can move from one city to another as long as it's connected by a line. Now you can go, the next thing you can do is take a direct flight. So both of my cards basically would point to different cities. If I wanted to, I could travel to either of the cities in my hand by discarding the card. So in this case, I have Milan and I have Khartoum. If I discard the card from Milan, I can move my piece directly to Milan. That's called direct flight. Now you can charter a flight, which is a different action. If I happen to start my turn, or at any point during my turn that I'm in that city, so let's say I've taken a couple actions and I'm on my 3rd action, and I start my turn in Milan, I can discard this card that matches that city that I'm in. For instance, this is Milan, to travel from that city to any other space on the board. So I can go from Milan to Johannesburg or Buenos Aires. It's totally up to me. But I have to be in that city when I play the card and take the action. Now the last thing you can do is you can move from one research station to another. So for instance, if I had a research station in Cairo and one in Atlanta, for 1 action I can fly from that research station to another, or back and forth. Now we have our special actions. Now you start the game with only 1 research station. So to get another research station on the board, for instance, I'm putting myself back in Milan, you have to discard a card matching the city you're in. So in this case, I'm discarding Milan in order to add another research station. Research stations are important because they do allow you to travel between them, but they're also the only place on the board where you can cure a disease. A disease is cured by discarding 5 cards of the matching color. So if I wanted to cure yellow disease, I would need 4 other cards in my hand of yellow color, be in the space with a research station, and then discard them. By doing that, I would cure the disease, the yellow disease, for the rest of the game. Okay. The next thing you do is you can remove a cube. So let's say that I moved up here to Toronto. For 1 action, I could remove a blue cube. For another action, I could remove another blue cube. And for my last action, I could remove the very final blue cube, curing all the diseases in Toronto. And the last thing you can do is if you and another player are in the same city that matches the card you have in your hand, you can trade it. So in this case, I've set myself up with another player in Milan. As an example, for an action, I could give my card that's Milan to that player, right? I, on my turn, take the action to give the player the card on their turn for an action on my turn. Now, if the card's in my hand and we happen to both be in the city on their turn, they can't spend the action. It has to be from me to that player spending the action. Okay? Okay. So that's the 8 different actions you can do. At the end of your turn, you will draw 2 new cards from the player's deck and add them to your hand. If one of them was an epidemic card, you would go through the actions of doing an epidemic. At the end of that, you'll turn over infection cards matching the current infection rate. So in this case, it's 2, but if it was 3, I'd turn over 3. For each card I turn over, I add a cube of that color to the board. So in this case, I'm going to add a cube to Moscow and add a cube to New York. Now, if this had been an infection card, or an epidemic card, so let's say I turned over the epidemic card, I would go through these steps. In this case, I would increase the infection rate. We would infect the bottom city, so in this case, I would add 3 cubes to Delhi to the board. Discard this card onto the discard. Shuffle this whole discard pile and place it back on top of the deck. We then infect cities at the same rate that the infection rate is after we discard the epidemic card. So we would get Hong Kong would get a cube, and Mumbai gets a cube. Now, if at any time the card that we turned over would add a cube to a city that already has 3 cubes, we have what's called an outbreak. An outbreak moves the outbreak marker up 1 space in the outbreaks track. If that ever gets to 8 outbreaks, the game is over. So in this case, let's say we had an outbreak in San Francisco. We would add a cube to each space on the board that's adjacent to San Francisco, including the 2 lines that go off the board. So we're going to add cubes over here to Tokyo and Osaka. Now, the thing you need to remember about outbreaks is they only outbreaks if it's the 3rd cube of the same color. So, for instance, if I had 3 red cubes in Tokyo and 1 blue cube in Tokyo, and I had to add another blue cube, that does not trigger an outbreak because it's not until I get 3 cubes of the same color. So if I kept playing this way, Tokyo could have 3 blue cubes and 3 red cubes and still not have an outbreak. It isn't until I add the 4th, I'm supposed to add a 4th cube of that color to that city that triggers that outbreak and then spreads cubes all adjacent. It is possible for an outbreak to trigger another outbreak. If you have an outbreak and you have to add a cube to another city that has 3 cubes, that also triggers an outbreak in that city because you can never have more than 3 cubes of the same color in a city. So it's possible to have a whole cascade of outbreaks all affecting each other, right? Creating the end of the game. So you want to make sure your outbreaks, your cities that have 3 cubes are spread apart and not right next to each other. Now, if you ever have to go and add a cube from the draw pile and there are no more cubes of that color, you also lose the game. If you ever have to draw from the player pile and there are no more cards here to draw, you also lose the game. The only way to win is to cure all 4 diseases before one of these conditions occurs. And remember, it takes 5 cards of the matching color discarded at a research station in order to cure the disease. So it's going to be up to you to work together, use the powers that you have in each game to make sure that you succeed. Each player is going to have a special power. So for instance, I'm the dispatcher. So on my turn, I have a special action that I can use to make a player move to another space. I can basically move anybody else's pawn as if it was my pawn. I can move them for one of my actions to another city. I could discard a card to fly them to another city, just as I could fly myself. I could spend a card to charter a flight for them. I basically am going to use their pawn as if it was my pawn. The scientist has the special ability that they only need 4 cards to cure a disease. So normally it takes 5, but if you have, if you're the scientist, you can use 4 cards, discard them at a research station, and cure a disease. The medic has a pretty neat power. The medic allows you to, for a single action, cure all the cubes of the same disease. So we had over here an example where we had blue cubes and red cubes in Tokyo. The medic, for one action, can remove all the red cubes from Tokyo. Now, it's still going to leave the blue cubes. They would have to cure those with another action, right? But a normal player, it would have taken 6 actions to remove all those cubes. The second part that a medic does that's really neat is when they have cured a disease, right? Just by moving into a space where you have cubes of a disease you've cured, you remove them from the board. Now, the other thing that you need to know about curing a disease that's really neat is if you manage to get all the cubes off the board that is of that color. So for instance, I have cured blue and I remove all the blue cubes. If I flip, basically what it's done is I've sunset that card. So now in the future, any blue cities that come up from the infection deck, if there's no blue cubes on the board and we've cured it, I will never add another blue cube to the board. Basically, we've eradicated that disease that is no longer in play. But as long as there's still a blue cube on the board, even though we've cured the disease, it is possible to keep adding blue cubes. So you'll have to get all the cubes off of that color in order to sunset a disease where it won't affect you anymore. The other role we have here is the researcher. The researcher allows you to trade cards between people even though your cards may not be of the same city you're in. So for instance, if I was the researcher and I was in New York, I could give as many cards as I wanted to the player that's with me in New York, and they don't have to be the New York card. The final role we have is the operations expert, and they can build research stations for free. So you can build a research station in any city. It doesn't cost you a card, it does cost you an action. You can also discard cards from a research station to fly to any other space on the board, as if that card matched the city you were in. So that's the charter flight action, and it basically allows you to charter flights from research stations with any card. So one of these four, you'll have, if you're playing with 4 players, you'll always have 4 of these roles in the game. The trick is to figure out how to use each person's power to the best of their ability. If you have the operations expert in your game, let them focus on building the research stations and don't do that so much. If you have the dispatcher, make sure that they're using their powers to move people around so they can use their actions to cure diseases. If you got the medic, you're going to want to make sure that they are actually fighting the disease on their turn and not worrying about their cards. The researcher, they're the ones that are going to need to get the cards to the right people. And then finally you have the scientist. You're going to try to want to get as many cards as you can to the scientist of the same color because they can cure the disease for less cards. If you can do all that before you get 8 outbreaks, before you run out of cubes, and before you run out of the player draw deck, you win. Otherwise, you're probably going to have a pandemic.